Hello, my name is Jerry Salyer. I'm a Latin and Humanities instructor for Immaculata Classical Academy right here in Louisville, Kentucky. And I'd like to speak with you today about this book, Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper, and maybe persuade you to read it. So at the outset, I'd like to give you just a general overview of reasons why you might like to read this book. One reason is that Last of the Mohicans fills in a gap in the American historical consciousness, namely the French and Indian War. Another reason why you might want to read Last of the Mohicans is because it shows us a romantic side of American history, an epic side of American history that you may not get out of other works of fiction or out of conventional histories. Then a third reason you might like to take a look at Last of the Mohicans is because of James Fenimore Cooper's great skill in portraying characters, a diverse array of characters. Then a fourth reason you might want to look at this book is because it is the masterwork of one of the great American writers and thinkers of the 19th century, and so it's a good introduction to Cooper himself. And then last but not least, I would suggest that reading the original book, I mean, this is kind of a cliche. You read the original book and you get a sense of what's left out of the movie or maybe what Hollywood got wrong. So I think probably more of my viewers today will be familiar with the movie version of Last of the Mohicans, and I think it's important to read the book and just realize how far Hollywood falls short. So those are my 5 reasons, and then let me get into them. So first, as I said, Last of the Mohicans fills in a gap in the American historical imagination. Most Americans are familiar, at least hopefully, are familiar with a few key episodes in American history. They tend to be fairly familiar with World War II. They tend to be fairly familiar with the war between the states, and they tend to be really familiar with the 1960s. These are all things that if I say personally, if I say this to students, usually they will, they will know what I'm talking about. They will, it will ring a bell. They know the Second World War, they know the Civil War, and they know the 60s, or they think they know. They've at least got that occupies a space in their imagination because, again, all 3 of these have had many movies, works of fiction, poetry. They just get a lot of attention. And of course, understandably so, they are important. But there are other parts of American history which are often forgotten, which are important too, such as the backdrop for Last of the Mohicans, which is the French and Indian War. This is not a podcast about the French and Indian War, so I'm not going to linger on it too long, but I guess I can say it's the prequel, you might say, to the American Revolution. In the decades, just a few decades before the American Revolution, what you had on the North American continent was 2 rival European powers, France and Britain, are settling, they're exploring, they're claiming territory, and they're also, each of them is forming alliances with the various native tribes that they encounter. Eventually, France and England, as many people know, there tends to be a long-standing tension between the two. And so when there's border disputes, who's going to claim what will later be called the Northwest Territory, this eventually breaks out into what we call the French and Indian War. And it's important. I mean, it's important. It's one of those things you don't notice for a variety of reasons. I think one of the reasons it doesn't fit into like maybe our very straightforward American narratives, our understanding of ourselves, but that's precisely why we should be aware of it. Certainly, it gives us a different perspective, and the book very much brings this out. It gives us a different perspective on the American Revolution, because in the book itself and in real life, what you see are American colonists, settlers, and frontiersmen fighting side by side as comrades in arms with British redcoats. Now, this is something that you would never guess, and you would never guess in a million years if you look at conventional interpretations of the American Revolution. If you look at let's say the film, the Mel Gibson movie, The Patriot, for instance, you would never guess in a million years that within living memory, people had American colonists and British redcoats had been allies, in some cases, presumably, the people who fight alongside each other. In some cases, they become very close. It's also worth noting the French and Indian War made a war hero out of a certain colonial militia officer named George Washington. So Washington's military career really got its first kick from the French and Indian War. And last but hardly least, the French and Indian War, obviously the British won. That's why that's why I'm speaking English right now. The British won, and this left the British with a great war debt. And of course, well, countries, when they have large debts, often what do they do to deal with that debt, to recover that money lost out of the treasury? They enact taxes. So this has a direct, this plays directly into the events that bring about the American Revolution. I'd also like to mention that, to develop what I said earlier about the French and Indian War maybe not entirely fitting into our general understanding of ourselves, there's a tendency to oversimplify American history. It's just this kind of march of democracy, march of democratic progress through history. If you look at the French and Indian War, it's absolutely a key part of American history, but it's definitely not in no sense is this a war for democracy. It's the kind of war, and you can see this in Last of the Mohicans. It's the kind of war that Homer and Virgil would have recognized. The motives for the combatants were very much classical motives, things like honor, glory, loyalty to friends, and national interest. So a unique conflict and one that's worth remembering. All right, so I've talked about, one reason is because, one reason to read Last of the Mohicans is because it fills in a gap in our historical imagination. The next thing I'd like to talk about, and I'll get into the actual plot here, is the way in which the book allows us to see the romantic dimension of American life. And I'll develop that in a moment, but first let me tell you the plot. So you know the backdrop is the French and Indian War. The plot is about a British major, a redcoat, an officer of the Royal Americans. That's the name of his, that's what he's referred to as, an officer of the Royal Americans, Major Hayward, who has been tasked to escort the two daughters of his commanding officer, General Monroe, through the wilderness. So he's kind of like playing the bodyguard to these two girls, Cora and Alice. And so, the story is this odyssey of Major Hayward as he's facing all these dangers along with the girls in the wilderness. And along the way, he makes friends. He finds friends. Actually, he would die and the girls would die too if they didn't win the friendship of a frontiersman who goes by the name of Hawkeye, and Hawkeye's two two Mohican friends. They're Mohicans, part of the remaining Mohicans, which is in turn part of a larger tribal cluster known as the Delawares. So the story is about Major Hayward, Alice and Cora, the girls that he's escorting, and then Chingachgook and Uncas, who are the last of the Mohicans. So the setting, and so that's the story. There's all kinds of fighting, and there's hiding, and there's ambushes, and there's mysterious rituals, and there's all kinds of stuff going on. And I'll say that the setting for this story really kind of contrasts with, I think, how a lot of people see America. And I can say for myself, this book was the first thing that popped into my mind when I was asked, if there was a book that I would want to talk about, because I've only read the book a couple years ago. I didn't read it when I was young. I only read it a couple years ago, and it knocked my socks off because you get a vision of America that's it's not it's almost as if for a lot of people and maybe not entirely, but to a certain extent, you get a sense that all the romance is over in Europe, or somewhere abroad. The Italians have piazzas with these centuries-old statues and fountains and things, and it's all very extraordinary and antique and picturesque. We have shopping malls and suburban sprawl and parking lots. Of course, that's an exaggeration, and that's not true. And Last of the Mohicans, you read Last of the Mohicans, and you realize just how romantic and how epic American, this place that we live in, actually is. You see the wilderness, you see the frontiersmen like Hawkeye, who is kind of a quasi-legendary figure. He's like a frontier cross between Robin Hood and William Tell. You see Uncas and his father Chingachgook, and they're kind of the last remnants of this very ancient, very important, almost kind of like the equivalent of a royal family. So there's a great deal of epic, there's a great deal of romance. I mean, one thing that maybe will illustrate it, I hope so, is, and it is a bit of a spoiler, but I'll read a brief excerpt from the book. This is a scene where Uncas has been captured. Uncas, the son, Chingachgook is his father. Uncas is the son. He is like the heir of the Mohicans, and he's also, in effect, you might say he's the equivalent of the rightful king of the Delawares. So the Mohicans are a subset or a tribe within the greater tribal cluster of the Delawares. And at one point, Uncas is captured by the Delawares, and they don't know who he is. They think he's just an enemy, and so they're preparing to execute him. But of course, when they execute him, or in order to execute him, they have to kind of rough him up. They have to tear off some of the covering, some of the clothing that he's got on, and then they see something which causes all of them to step back in awe. So I'll just read this point where Uncas is almost going to be executed. Uncas alone had preserved his serenity. He looked on the preparations for his execution with a steady eye, and when the tormentors came to seize him, he met them with a firm and upright attitude. One among them, if possible, more fierce and savage than his fellow, seized the hunting shirt of the young warrior and at a single effort tore it from his body. Then with a yell of frantic pleasure, he leapt towards his unresisting victim and prepared to lead him to the stake. So he's going to be burned at the stake. But at that moment, when the Delaware appeared most a stranger to the feelings of humanity, the purpose of the savage was arrested as suddenly as if a supernatural agency had interposed on behalf of Uncas. The eyeballs of the Delaware seemed to start from their sockets. His mouth opened and his whole form became frozen in an attitude of amazement. Raising his hand with a slow and regulated motion, he pointed with a finger to the bosom of the captive. His companions crowded about him in wonder, and every eye was, like his own, fastened intently on the figure of a small tortoise, beautifully tattooed on the breast of the prisoner in a bright blue tint. So this may, and again, this may not have done, quite justice to how it works into the text, because there's a lead up to this as well. But it's Uncas. It's as if Uncas. The analogy in Western culture might be something where the boy Arthur pulls the sword out of the stone, like, and reveals himself as the rightful king of England. Here, Uncas. The blue tortoise tattoo, which is the mark of the ruler of the Mohicans, who in turn is the ruler of all of the Delawares. This is revealed to the Delawares, and they all prostrate themselves. He is their long lost king, so to speak. So, we've talked about the gap in the American historical imagination that can be filled by having a narrative set in the French and Indian War, and we've talked about the romantic quality of Last of the Mohicans. I'd like to also talk about the diversity of characters that James Fenimore Cooper brings out in this story, and I mean diversity in more than one sense. You can think of it certainly in the conventional sense, somewhat as we think of it today, as ethnic and national diversity. You see not only Americans, but you also see you see American colonists, but you also see British, like Major Hayward, and you also see Frenchmen. Their French enemies do feature significantly in this, in Last of the Mohicans, and they are real characters. You also see the various American Indians, and it was very clear reading this, Cooper was perfectly well aware that these are different. These are each Native American tribe is different. They have different customs, different history, different culture, different religion, different language, and he really does a fantastic job of bringing this out. He doesn't just portray them. They're all just American Indians and they're all the same. No, they're not. And he's very clear about that. So you get a sense of the real diversity of all these different peoples. I'd also say he brings out the diversity of just individuals, of individual character types. For instance, there's a striking contrast between Major Hayward, who is a British officer and gentleman, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, we have Hawkeye, who is a frontiersman, who was not interested in the ways of civilization. And the nice thing about Cooper is he doesn't point to one or the other and say, okay, this guy is good, that guy's not good. They're both heroes, but they're different. I mean, they're clearly different. So Cooper brings out the fact that there are different kinds of people in the world, and that's okay. I'd also I've talked about the gap in our historical imagination and I've talked about the romantic quality of the book, and I've also mentioned that Cooper is really great at bringing out individual characters and all their differences and all this kind of the rich diversity. I'd also like to mention and point out that James Fenimore Cooper is just an interesting man in his own right, early 19th century figure who this certainly isn't the only book he wrote. It's part of a series called the Leatherstocking Tales, which revolve around the life and adventures of Hawkeye, even though Hawkeye is he's not really the main character in this particular novel. I would say it's Major Hayward, but Hawkeye is certainly important, and this series by Cooper follows Hawkeye from his youth all the way to his old age and his death. In addition, Cooper was something of a political theorist. He wrote I haven't read the whole thing, but I've read parts of it. He wrote a book called The American Democrat, which is his thoughts on democracy and how it could be made to work. Cooper was convinced that it couldn't just work just by mindlessly embracing, let's say egalitarianism. He thought that it required a certain amount of prudence. So Cooper himself is an interesting man in his own right as a thinker. And then, so I've talked about the gap in our historical imagination. I've talked about the romantic quality of the book. And by the way, if you get it, let me just add, if you do get Last of the Mohicans, I would suggest this edition, which has illustrations by N.C. Wyeth, who's kind of a classic illustrator. And they are, the illustrations really add to it. Certainly, as I said, the romantic quality is brought out by the illustrator. So in addition to the romantic and the aspect and the historical imagination, we've talked about the diversity of characters. We've talked about Cooper as a figure, somebody interesting and worth knowing about. Last but not least, I would just, and I don't mean to step on anybody's toes. I know there's probably a lot of people are really fond of the Daniel Day-Lewis movie, Last of the Mohicans. Well, I have to say it's got some limits. It's got some serious limitations. A friend of mine, the classicist Thomas Fleming, once pointed out. It didn't really register with me until he mentioned this, that the hunting scene at the beginning of the movie is a little over the top. It shows in the movie we see, the movie opens with Hawkeye, Chingachgook, and Uncas chasing a deer through the forest, and they're hunting. They're going after the deer, and each of them is carrying, I think, they're carrying their musket with them, and they're chasing after the deer. And when you stop and think about it, and again, you don't need to know a lot about hunting. You just have to know something about deer. You don't hunt deer by running after it on foot through the forest. That's not going to work. You raise a question of the realism of the movie, but on an even deeper level, probably the deeper flaw is the Hollywood movie, and I think this shows a weakness in the American character. It has a anti-British streak that comes up at a number of points of the movie. The colonists are repeatedly shown as resenting the British presence, and that's purely projection. By our part, based on we know what's going to happen, but I can assure you, at the time of the French and Indian War, the colonists, the British are there to protect them from the French, who certainly mean business and would drive them out if they could. So that's a case where we, you might say, what's sometimes called presentism, where we're taking our assumptions of the present and projecting them onto the past. And so I would recommend, if you see the movie, that's fine. You enjoy it, that's fine. But take it with a grain of salt, and I would recommend reading the book. So that's what I have, and thank you for your time.